Hey there, folks. I'm Happy. Out here in the deep woods of the Northwest, surrounded by the whispering pines and my wild, furry neighbors, I've learned that the most broken things can always be mended. Today, I want to tell you a story not about the wilderness, but about a man named Ethan, a brilliant soul shattered by grief, a little girl who never lost faith, and a miracle born in the heart of a thunderstorm. It's a tale of healing that hits close to home. Before we begin, where are you tuning in from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join our camp. The rain came down hard enough that night to blur the edges of Route 2, a lonely, winding stretch of asphalt cutting through the dense, heavily breathing pine forests of Washington state. Seattle lay miles behind us, a ghost city drowned in the storm, while the night sky offered nothing but the relentless, sideways drumming of a Pacific Northwest tempest. Every headlight that passed us was nothing more than a smeared streak of amber against the absolute dark. I sat in the passenger seat of the lifeless vehicle, watching the hazard lights pulse a slow, rhythmic warning against the wet pavement. My name is Wilder. I am a man built entirely for the quiet shadows of powerful people. I am tall, severely thin, with a rigid posture ruined by decades of leaning over executive schedules, corporate briefings, and crisis reports. A childhood spent in a chaotic, fiercely loud, and unpredictable household in Chicago made me crave silence and absolute order above all else, molding me into an executive assistant who speaks only when strictly necessary. I have a demeanor swept entirely clean of panic. But on this night, my meticulous organizational skills and deep reservoirs of calm were entirely useless against a highly classified twin-turbo V8 hybrid engine that had simply decided to die in the dark. Beside me, gripping the leather steering wheel of the dead Sterling Motors luxury prototype, sat Arthur Sterling himself. Arthur is 71 years old, possessing a face carved from unyielding granite and a mane of thick, silver hair that stubbornly refuses to thin. He wore a bespoke, charcoal gray suit even on this quiet weekend retreat, a sartorial habit born from growing up dirt poor in the rusted, unforgiving heart of Detroit. He dresses every single day like a man who refuses to let poverty ever catch him off guard again. He is a stern, fiercely commanding presence, a man who dictates the flow of entire industries. Yet, sitting beside him in the quiet cold of the broken car, I could sense beneath his titanium exterior the profound, quiet exhaustion of a man who has carried an automotive empire on his shoulders for 4 decades. He had already called the private towing service. The wait was estimated at 3 agonizing hours. Arthur did not complain. He did not curse. He simply stared into the relentless rain, accepting the delay with the grim, immovable stoicism of a CEO who knows that anger cannot fix machinery. Then, a pair of dull headlights cut through the deluge. A battered 1998 Ford pickup truck slowed down, its engine rattling with a familiar metallic weariness that spoke of years of hard labor. It pulled onto the narrow shoulder just ahead of us, its tires crunching on the wet gravel, and a man stepped out into the freezing downpour. His name, as we would soon learn, was Ethan Carter. Ethan is 34, broad-shouldered and physically capable, yet he leans slightly forward when he walks, as if he is perpetually carrying a heavy, invisible weight. His dark, unruly hair was instantly plastered to his forehead by the rain, framing a sharp jawline shadowed by a 3-day beard. But it was his eyes that held you. They were the exact color of old, settled engine oil, deep, quiet, and hauntingly vacant. 5 years ago, a devastating car crash took his wife from him, an event that tore his soul down to the bare wooden studs. The tragedy had violently burned away all his worldly ambitions, his drive for corporate success, leaving behind only a fierce, protective gentleness and a quiet, impenetrable humility. He moved toward our stranded vehicle with the deliberate, unhurried grace of a man who no longer cares about rushing toward anything. Wearing a faded canvas mechanic's jacket that offered no real protection from the biting cold, Ethan tapped lightly on Arthur's window. He didn't ask what was wrong, nor did he posture. He simply offered, in a low, gravelly voice, to take a look under the hood. Arthur hesitated. The president of Sterling Motors was certainly not accustomed to letting a random roadside stranger touch a highly proprietary, multi-million-dollar prototype. But the rain was unforgiving. The temperature in the cabin was dropping rapidly, and the sheer silence of his own dead engine was an unbearable insult to Arthur's pride. Reluctantly, with a tight nod, he unlatched the hood. Ethan did not run back to his truck to fetch a diagnostic tablet. He didn't ask for the vehicle's manual or question Arthur about the dashboard error codes. He simply propped open the hood, stood in the driving rain with water cascading down his back, and leaned over the breathtakingly complex architecture of the hybrid engine. Then, he closed his eyes. He rested one bare, grease-stained, calloused hand lightly on the cold metal of the intake manifold. He listened. It was exactly the way a skilled, veteran physician listens to a chest, finding the critical answers, not in the noise, but in the negative space, in the subtle absence of the right mechanical rhythms. Within moments, his eyes snapped open. He moved with sudden, surgical precision. He pulled just two basic, worn tools from his jacket pocket. He had instantly recognized a cascading electrical failure in the high-pressure fuel pump relay, a microscopic, compounding flaw that our own elite engineering division had completely missed during months of rigorous testing. Without a word of explanation, he bypassed the faulty line, rerouting the electrical load with a terrifying, quiet confidence. Exactly 30 minutes later, Ethan turned the ignition. The engine caught instantly. It roared into the wet night, idling smoother, deeper, and cleaner than it had when it left the sterile laboratory. Arthur stepped out of the car, entirely ignoring the rain soaking his expensive, bespoke suit. He stood looking at this dripping stranger with the intense, calculating focus he usually reserved for high-stakes board meetings. Arthur reached for his wallet and asked him what he owed him for the miracle. Ethan simply wiped his wet, stained hands on an oily rag, shook his head slowly, and said it was a minor fix, nothing worth charging money for. Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly, processing this rarity. He did not push the money, but he demanded Ethan's name and the exact address of his workplace. Ethan provided them quietly, spelling out the name of a small, obscure garage, doing so without a shred of pride or expectation, before turning his back and walking away to his rattling truck. I did not know it then, shivering in the passenger seat of that reborn prototype as we drove away, but 40 miles to the south, in a small, weathered house tucked away in the quiet, working-class suburbs of Seattle, entirely different kind of waiting was taking place. In a dimly lit living room, warmed only by a small space heater, a 7-year-old girl named Lily sat cross-legged on a faded floral rug. Lily is small for her age, possessing a wild mop of unruly chestnut curls that perfectly match the mother she barely remembers. She has an old soul's absolute quietness, fiercely loyal and deeply observant, taking in the world with wide, understanding eyes. In her small arms, she tightly clutched Barnaby, a plush brown teddy bear missing its left button eye, a tragic casualty of a playground incident years ago that Ethan had painstakingly stitched shut. Watching over her from a worn armchair was Mrs. Higgins, the next-door neighbor and trusted babysitter. Mrs. Higgins is 68, a delightfully plump, flour-dusted woman with a face as round and warmly inviting as a freshly baked pie. Her own husband had passed away a decade ago, leaving her with a vast, echoing house and an immense excess of maternal energy, which she generously poured over Lily whenever Ethan worked late. She is soft-spoken and endlessly patient, wearing a thick, oversized knit cardigan that always smells faintly of vanilla extract and old library paper. "It's getting past 9, sweetheart," Mrs. Higgins said, her voice a gentle, soothing rumble against the harsh sound of the rain lashing the window panes. "Your father would want you to be in bed. It's a terrible night out there." Lily slowly shook her head, her chestnut curls bouncing lightly against her small shoulders. She did not whine, nor did she throw a tantrum as other children might. She simply tightened her grip on the one-eyed bear and fixed her gaze steadily on the front door. "He promised," Lily said, her small voice possessing a quiet, unbreakable certainty that perfectly mirrored the broken man currently driving a battered Ford pickup through the storm. "He promised he would read me a story tonight. He always comes home." And in that small, rain-swept house, the profound, fragile arithmetic of a life balanced entirely on the love between a grieving father and his waiting daughter ticked by second, completely unaware of the collision of worlds that had just irrevocably occurred on Route 2. Chapter 2. The Mystery of the Recluse. The gleaming glass and brushed steel monolith of Sterling Motors headquarters in downtown Seattle felt worlds away from the rain-soaked asphalt of Route 2. On the 42nd floor, the executive conference room was dominated by a massive holographic projection of our flagship project, the Apex 5.8 Hybrid. It was a masterpiece of modern automotive engineering, or at least it was supposed to be. For the past 6 months, the prototype had been nothing more than a beautiful, multi-million-dollar paperweight. Standing at the head of the long mahogany table, bathed in the cool blue light of the hologram, was Olivia Sterling. Olivia is 32 years old, possessing her father's piercing, uncompromising eyes and the same sharp, aristocratic jawline. However, where Arthur's expression is usually set in immovable granite, Olivia's face currently carried the deep, bruised shadows of chronic exhaustion. She wore a severely tailored navy blue blazer that she wore more like armor than corporate attire. As the project director, she had spent the last year fighting a brutal two-front war, one against the unforgiving laws of thermodynamics, and the other against the suffocating expectations attached to her last name. She is fiercely intelligent and deeply empathetic with her team, driven by an obsessive need to prove she earned her position through pure merit rather than bloodline. But the relentless engineering delays were visibly fracturing her spirit. Sitting directly opposite her, leaning back in his leather chair with an air of practiced disdain, was Marcus Vance. Marcus is a senior board member and the primary architect of Olivia's current misery. He is a man in his late 50s who looks as though he was manufactured in a corporate laboratory rather than born. He is impeccably sleek, with an unwrinkled complexion, silver hair slicked back with expensive precision, and a thin, predatory smile that never quite reaches his cold, reptilian green eyes. Marcus is a financial vulture, a man who calculates the worth of art strictly by its auction price. To him, cars are not moving poetry or engineering marvels, but mere line items on a quarterly profit margin. "The numbers do not lie, Olivia," Marcus said, his voice a smooth, venomous purr that echoed in the quiet room. "The thermal management system on the V8 block is a catastrophic failure. Your engineering team has burned through an additional $20 million in R&D, and the engine still overheats within 12 minutes of peak load. The board is losing patience. I am formally recommending that we scrap the proprietary engine development and outsource a standardized block to cut our losses." Olivia's hands tightened into fists at her sides, her knuckles turning white. "Outsourcing the engine destroys the entire soul of the Apex project, Marcus. We are on the verge of a breakthrough. The cooling architecture just needs a paradigm shift. If you kill the funding now, you render the last 3 years of innovation completely meaningless." "I don't care about the soul of the car, sweetheart," Marcus replied, his condescension dripping from every syllable. "I care about the shareholders. You have 2 weeks before the quarterly vote. If that engine isn't running perfectly by then, I will personally see to it that the board pulls the plug." Arthur sat quietly at the far end of the table, his face an unreadable mask. He knew Marcus was toxic, a necessary evil kept around for his ruthless efficiency in mergers. But right now, Marcus was a direct threat to Arthur's legacy and his daughter's career. Arthur abruptly stood up, signaling the immediate end of the meeting. He dismissed everyone except me. As the heavy glass doors hissed shut, leaving us alone in the cavernous room, Arthur turned to the window, looking out over the gray Seattle skyline. "The boy in the rain, Wilder," Arthur said suddenly, his voice low and urgent. "The one with the battered Ford. He didn't just fix a fuel pump. He bypassed a cascading electrical failure in a proprietary system he had never seen before, and he did it by sound alone. I want to know everything about him. I want to know how a mechanic in a roadside shack understands high-voltage integration better than my entire floor of PhDs." I nodded, retreating to my office to begin the quiet, invisible work I do best. I expected to find a competent, perhaps lucky, local mechanic with a knack for tinkering. I did not expect to unearth a ghost. It took me less than 3 hours to bypass the superficial public records and dive into the archived engineering registries. When I finally compiled the dossier and brought it into Arthur's office, the weight of the paper in my hands felt remarkably heavy. "His name is Ethan Carter," I began, placing the open file on Arthur's desk. "And he is not just a mechanic, sir. 5 years ago, he was widely considered one of the most brilliant mechanical minds of his generation." Arthur leaned forward, his eyes scanning the documents. I watched his expression shift from curiosity to profound shock as he read through Ethan's history. Ethan hadn't just worked in the industry. He had been the chief engineer for a cutting-edge European aerospace and automotive firm. He held 7 distinct patents in thermodynamics and fluid mechanics, the exact fields our Apex project was currently failing in. He was a rising star, a prodigy who built engines that defied conventional limitations. Then why the hell is he changing oil in a shack on the outskirts of the city? Arthur demanded, looking up at me in disbelief. I turned to the final page of the dossier. There was a photograph attached, a clipping from a local newspaper dated exactly 5 years ago. It showed a twisted, unrecognizable wreck of a vehicle at an intersection. Because of Evelyn, I said softly. His wife, Evelyn Carter, had been a vibrant, deeply beloved kindergarten teacher. According to the reports, she was a woman whose warmth and radiant energy had grounded Ethan's intense, obsessive genius. She was slight of build, with a bright, open smile and a spirit that drew people toward her like a hearth fire in winter. She had been on her way home from school when a drunk driver ran a red light, striking her car on the driver's side. She died instantly. The psychological impact on Mr. Carter was absolute, I explained, keeping my tone perfectly neutral despite the tragedy of the facts. He didn't just resign from his position, he completely amputated his past life. He sold their luxury home, liquidated his stock options, and vanished from the corporate world entirely. He bought that small, obscure garage to maintain complete anonymity. He did it so he could dictate his own hours, dedicating every remaining ounce of his existence to raising their daughter Lily, away from the demanding, soul-crushing hours of executive engineering. Arthur stared at the photograph of the young, smiling woman in the file for a long, silent moment. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with devastating clarity. The vacant, haunted look in Ethan's eyes on the highway wasn't just fatigue. It was the hollowed-out aftermath of a man who had lost his entire world. Arthur closed the folder. The silence in the office was absolute. He now knew he had found the only man on Earth capable of saving the V8 engine, securing Sterling Motors' future, and protecting Olivia from Marcus Vance's corporate guillotine. But Arthur also knew, with a heavy, sinking certainty, that offering a massive salary to a man who had intentionally walked away from millions would never work. "Clear my schedule for tomorrow morning, Wilder," Arthur commanded, his voice carrying a new, resolute edge. "I am going to pay Mr. Carter a visit, and I am not coming back until he agrees to help us." Chungba, Loi Tu Choi, Chonggaraku. The morning fog had barely lifted off the damp, industrial outskirts of Seattle when I parked Arthur's understated black sedan across the street from Carter Automotive. It was a modest, weathered, cinder-block building, its faded painted sign peeling under the relentless Pacific Northwest dampness. Inside, the air was thick with the honest, heavy scents of motor oil, hot metal, and old coffee. Lying squarely in the center of the main service bay was Rusty. Rusty is a 12-year-old golden retriever mix with a graying muzzle, a pronounced limp in his left hind leg from a forgotten injury, and a temperament of absolute, unshakable laziness. He was a neighborhood stray until Ethan took him in 3 years ago. Now, he acts as a furry, immovable speed bump, requiring everyone to carefully step over his softly snoring form. Arthur Sterling stepped into the garage, his bespoke charcoal suit a sharp, almost jarring contrast to the grease-stained concrete. Ethan was underneath a suspended sedan, his hands moving with that same quiet, surgical rhythm we had witnessed on Route 2. When he saw Arthur, he calmly wiped his hands on a shop rag, offering a polite but visibly guarded nod. Arthur did not waste time with corporate pleasantries. He laid out the existential crisis at Sterling Motors, the stalling Apex 5.8 project, and formally offered Ethan the position of chief engineer. "You hold 7 patents in thermodynamics, Ethan," Arthur said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous garage. "Your work redefined hybrid architecture 5 years ago. You belong in a state-of-the-art laboratory, pushing the boundaries of human engineering, not patching up rusted mufflers. I am offering you the resources to finish what you started, with a compensation package that will secure your daughter's future for generations." It was the kind of astronomical offer that men in our industry spend their entire lives praying for. Ethan listened patiently, his dark, quiet eyes fixed unwaveringly on Arthur. When the president finally finished his pitch, Ethan gently patted Rusty's head and shook his own. He declined. There was no anger, no posturing, no clever negotiation tactics, just a flat, immovable rejection. "I respect what you've built, Mr. Sterling," Ethan said, his voice low, steady, and devoid of regret. But corporate engineering demands 80-hour weeks. It demands your soul, your sleep, and your evenings. 5 years ago, I learned the hard way that time is the only currency that actually matters. Ethan gestured toward a small, colorful crayon drawing of a blue house pinned securely to his heavy metal tool chest. I made a vow after my wife passed. I am the one who makes Lily her pancakes every single morning. I drop her off at school at 8, and I am standing at those gates at exactly 3 o'clock to bring her home. Money can buy her a massive trust fund, Mr. Sterling, but it cannot buy her a father who is actually present. No project, no matter how prestigious, is going to take me away from her again. Arthur, a man who had sacrificed vast expanses of his own family time to build an empire, stood silently in the garage. He understood the profound, heavy truth of Ethan's words far too well to argue. He quietly left his private card on the scarred workbench and walked out, looking remarkably older than when he had entered. I would later learn that the Sterling family's interaction with Ethan Carter did not end that morning. Driven by a fierce, desperate curiosity about the legendary recluse who had dared to reject her powerful father, Olivia Sterling orchestrated her own quiet reconnaissance mission the following afternoon. To avoid immediate recognition, she borrowed a vehicle from Chloe. Chloe is Olivia's 22-year-old junior assistant, a perpetually anxious recent graduate who favors brightly colored cardigans and bites her nails down to the quick whenever Marcus Vance enters a room. More importantly, Chloe drives a sputtering, violently coughing 2010 Honda Civic with a wildly unpredictable alternator. Olivia swapped her intimidating, tailored corporate armor for faded denim jeans, a bulky, oversized knit sweater, and clear-framed glasses, tying her dark, perfect hair into a messy, unremarkable bun. When she pulled the struggling Civic into Carter Automotive, Ethan approached without a shred of judgment for the old machine. Olivia played the part of a frustrated, ordinary commuter, sitting quietly in the small, worn waiting area while Ethan went to work. Through the smudged plexiglass window, she closely watched the genius her father had praised. She witnessed those magical, calloused hands expertly coax the dying alternator back to life with a graceful, effortless efficiency that made her own elite engineers at Sterling Motors look like fumbling amateurs. But it was what she saw next that truly dismantled her carefully constructed defenses. School had just let out, and little Lily was sitting on a high wooden stool near the workbench, her small legs swinging happily. Ethan did not shoo her away from the dangerous workspace. Instead, he seamlessly and naturally integrated her into it. While his right hand expertly adjusted a tension belt on the Civic's engine, his left hand gently guided Lily's small fingers as they assembled a complex plastic model of a race car. "See this little gear, Bug?" Ethan's deep voice drifted through the open door, soft and entirely stripped of the haunting emptiness it usually carried. "The small one does all the heavy lifting so the big one can spin fast. Just like teamwork." Lily giggled, her bright eyes shining with absolute, unfiltered adoration for her father. Olivia sat frozen in the cheap plastic waiting chair, her breath catching suddenly in her throat. She had spent her entire adult life surrounded by cold, calculated men who measured their worth in profit margins, market shares, and boardroom victories, men who routinely abandoned their families for a corner office. Watching Ethan gently wipe a smudge of black grease from his daughter's nose, Olivia felt a sudden, unexpected flutter in her chest. The impenetrable, icy wall she had built around her own heart over years of brutal corporate warfare cracked just a fraction. She realized then that Ethan Carter was not just a brilliant engineer hiding from the world. He was a deeply wounded, intensely warm man, fiercely protecting the only light he had left. When he finally handed her the keys to the smoothly running Civic, charging her a shockingly meager fee, Olivia offered a genuine, breathless smile, walking away with a heart beating in an entirely new and fragile rhythm. Chapter 4. The Contract of Understanding. Arthur Sterling was not a man who accepted defeat, especially when the survival of his legacy and his daughter's career hung precariously in the balance. When we returned to the towering glass citadel of Sterling Motors after that initial, stingingly polite rejection, Arthur did not demand another engineering review. Instead, he immediately summoned Julian Thorne. Julian is our chief corporate counsel, a fiercely bald, immaculately groomed man of 45 who wears round tortoiseshell glasses and possesses a perpetual expression of mild indigestion whenever he is forced to deal with anything outside standard corporate precedents. Julian is a man who breathes through legal loopholes and lives for ironclad non-disclosure agreements, rendering him entirely ill-equipped for Arthur's sudden, wildly unorthodox demands. For 3 grueling days, Arthur locked Julian and me in the executive suite, commanding us to draft a contract that defied every established rule of corporate engagement. There were to be no mandated office hours and no required weekend retreats. Instead, the contract included the deed to a beautifully restored, mid-century modern house nestled securely on the heavily wooded edge of the Sterling Motors Research and Development Campus. More radically, Arthur ordered the immediate architectural redesign of the chief engineer's suite. He mandated the construction of a custom, soundproofed, glass-walled educational playroom physically attached to the main office, complete with a private tutor and an open-door policy that explicitly allowed a 7-year-old girl to bypass all corporate security protocols. Julian argued vehemently, his manicured hands fluttering nervously over the unprecedented liability clauses, but Arthur silenced him with a single, unyielding glare. Arthur understood something profound that Julian's rigid legal mind could not grasp. To hire a man who had intentionally walked away from the world, you could not simply offer him a job. You had to offer him a sanctuary. What neither Arthur nor I knew as we meticulously crafted this sanctuary was that a profound, quiet revolution was simultaneously taking place inside Ethan Carter's weathered suburban home. As Ethan would much later confide in me during a quiet evening over a glass of scotch, the turning point had arrived on a rainy Tuesday night. While Ethan was in the kitchen struggling to fix a broken pipe, Lily had been playing in his dimly lit study. Driven by a child's innocent, boundless curiosity, she had managed to pry open the heavy, notoriously sticky bottom drawer of his old oak desk. Hidden beneath stacks of mundane utility bills and old tax returns were several thick, rolled-up sheets of drafting paper. They were Ethan's final, unfinished blueprints complex, brilliant thermodynamic schematics he had been designing just weeks before his wife, Evelyn, was killed. He had shoved them into that dark drawer 5 years ago, unable to look at the mechanical poetry that had once defined his soul. When Ethan finally walked into the study, wiping his wet hands on a towel, he froze. Lily was sitting cross-legged on the floor, the massive, highly technical blueprints spread out like a picnic blanket around her. She had taken her brightest, waxiest crayons and was carefully drawing vibrant pink and yellow flowers directly over the intricate, mathematically perfect diagrams of engine airflow and heat displacement. A sudden wave of panic and old, jagged grief flared tightly in Ethan's chest. He stepped forward to pull the papers away, to protect the sacred, painful relics of his past. But before he could speak, Lily looked up at him. Her large chestnut eyes were completely clear and filled with a simple, profound wisdom. She pointed a small, wax-stained finger at a bright yellow sunflower she had drawn over a primary combustion chamber. "I made them pretty for you, Daddy," she said, her voice soft and light. "Mom in heaven would probably want to see you make beautiful cars like this. She always loved when you smiled in the garage." Those simple, innocent words from his 7-year-old daughter acted as the final, shattering blow to the heavy, iron vault Ethan had locked his heart inside. The psychological knot he had tightly pulled around his own neck for half a decade, the crushing guilt, the belief that pursuing his genius was somehow a betrayal of his grieving family suddenly unraveled. He dropped to his knees on the faded carpet, pulling Lily into a fierce, trembling embrace, crying quietly into her unruly hair, while the vibrant crayon flowers bloomed brightly against the cold, clinical lines of his forgotten masterpiece. He realized then that burying his gift wasn't protecting Lily, it was only hiding from his own pain. Evelyn had loved his passion. She had fallen in love with the fiery, brilliant man who wanted to change the world, not the hollow ghost hiding in a rusted garage. Thus, when Arthur Sterling's sleek black sedan pulled back into the driveway of Carter Automotive later that week, Ethan was no longer the immovable, defensive recluse we had encountered days prior. Julian Thorne stepped out of the vehicle first, clutching his leather briefcase as if the grease-stained air of the garage might infect him, followed closely by Arthur and myself. Ethan met us at the entrance, wiping his hands on a rag, his dark eyes looking remarkably clearer. The heavy, invisible weight he always carried seemingly lifted. Arthur did not offer a grand speech this time. He simply took the thick, leather-bound contract from Julian's trembling hands and placed it gently on the scarred wooden workbench. "I listened to you, Ethan," Arthur said quietly, his voice carrying the deep, resonant gravity of a fellow father. "I cannot give you back the time you lost, but I can give you the environment to protect the time you have left." Ethan slowly opened the heavy folder. He read the clauses outlining the beautiful house on the edge of the R&D campus, guaranteeing Lily would grow up in a pristine, highly secure environment with access to the finest schools in the state. His eyes scanned the unprecedented paragraphs, detailing his absolute scheduling autonomy. But it was the architectural mock-ups of the office that finally made his breath hitch. A beautiful, sunlit, glass-enclosed playroom located directly adjacent to his drafting table, ensuring that he could look up from a multi-million-dollar hybrid schematic and instantly see his daughter reading or playing, separated only by an inch of soundproof glass. Julian stood awkwardly in the corner, nervously adjusting his tortoiseshell glasses, fully expecting the gritty mechanic to laugh at the absurd legal document. Instead, Ethan reached into the pocket of his faded canvas jacket, pulling out a cheap blue ballpoint pen. He looked at the contract, then looked out the open garage door toward the sky, a soft, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth, as if acknowledging a silent, invisible presence. Without asking a single question or demanding a single amendment, Ethan Carter leaned over the workbench and signed his name, officially stepping out of the shadows and back into the light to reclaim his stolen destiny. Chapter 5. The Awakening Engine and New Vibrations. The atmosphere inside the subterranean research and development wing of Sterling Motors shifted the moment Ethan Carter walked through the reinforced security doors. He did not arrive in a sharp corporate suit, nor did he carry a briefcase full of theoretical projections. He arrived in his familiar, faded canvas jacket, carrying a worn leather satchel of hand-drawn schematics, immediately transforming the sterile, highly strung corporate laboratory into an extension of his own intuitive, practical garage. To assist him in translating his vision into corporate reality, we assigned Leo Mercer as his direct liaison. Leo is a 26-year-old junior thermodynamics engineer with a perpetually sleep-deprived pallor, an unruly mop of tightly coiled black hair, and a nervous habit of chewing relentlessly on the plastic ends of his digital stylus. He is brilliant in a purely academic sense, a child prodigy who skipped 2 grades and graduated at the absolute top of his class at MIT, but he entirely lacked the tactile, instinctive connection to physical machinery that Ethan possessed. Leo initially approached his new chief engineer with the rigid, defensive skepticism of a textbook academic. But within 3 short days, I watched that skepticism dissolve into absolute, wide-eyed reverence. Ethan did not merely adjust the failing V8 hybrid engine, he fundamentally deconstructed its mechanical soul. Relying on his profound, almost terrifying understanding of fluid dynamics, he completely restructured the thermal management pathways. He entirely discarded our elite team's complex, over-engineered electronic cooling pumps, replacing them with a brilliantly simplified, mechanically driven convection cycle that utilized the engine's own intense heat to pull coolant directly through the block's most critical friction points. Furthermore, he subtly altered the internal combustion timing, softening the aggressive detonation spikes that had been silently fracturing the ceramic apex seals under heavy load. He worked with a quiet, relentless intensity, standing for hours at his large drafting table, separated from the corporate chaos by the newly installed, soundproofed glass wall of Lily's custom playroom. It was through that remarkably clear pane of glass that the most profound transformation of all quietly unfolded. Olivia Sterling, the fiercely driven project director who had previously lived on a destructive diet of black coffee and sheer anxiety, found herself inexplicably drawn to that sunlit enclosure. Initially, her visits were framed as brief, professional check-ins on her new chief engineer, but soon the administrative excuse evaporated, revealing a genuine, deep-seated affection. Olivia and Ethan rapidly developed into an exceptionally formidable team, their professional synergy operating flawlessly. Ethan provided the raw, brilliant engineering solutions, while Olivia skillfully navigated the treacherous corporate bureaucracy, shielding him from board interference and ensuring his requested materials were fast-tracked without question. But when the grueling technical meetings finally concluded, Olivia would quietly slip into the glass playroom. She would eagerly trade her intimidating corporate blazers for comfortable sweaters, sitting cross-legged on the plush carpet beside Lily. She helped the little girl navigate her new advanced tutoring curriculum, and she frequently brought small, exquisitely detailed die-cast models of vintage Sterling automobiles from her private collection to add to Lily's growing fleet. I vividly remember the late afternoon when Lily, clutching a miniature silver roadster in her small hands, looked up with her bright, chestnut eyes and solemnly dubbed Olivia the car fairy. The nickname stuck instantly. Ethan, covered in engine grease and poring over a complex telemetry readout, paused his work. He looked through the glass, watching his daughter laugh, a pure, unburdened sound that vibrated warmly through the heavy barrier while Olivia smiled back, her sharp, aristocratic features entirely softened by genuine, uncalculated joy. For 5 agonizing years, Ethan had kept his heart locked tightly inside a freezing, impenetrable vault of grief and survivor's guilt, convinced that his capacity for romantic love had died permanently in the twisted wreckage of his wife's car. But watching Olivia gently brush a stray curl from Lily's forehead, the thick ice surrounding his heart finally, undeniably fractured. He realized, with a sudden tightness in his chest that had absolutely nothing to do with sorrow, that the deep, echoing void within him was beginning to fill with a new, vibrant warmth. He was finally ready to live, and more importantly, he was ready to open his soul to love again. The ultimate test of both his engineering genius and this fragile new beginning arrived exactly 2 months after Ethan's employment began. The atmosphere in the subterranean dynamometer testing chamber, a heavily armored, concrete-lined room designed to safely contain catastrophic engine failures, was thick with a suffocating electrical tension. Marcus Vance stood at the very back of the observation deck, his arms crossed tightly over his impeccably tailored suit, his reptilian green eyes locked on the heavily wired prototype V8 engine sitting on the test stand. Marcus had arrived, fully expecting to witness a spectacular $30 million bonfire, armed with the legal paperwork required to immediately terminate the Apex project and fire Olivia the exact moment the engine seized. Arthur Sterling stood beside him, a statue of quiet, imposing authority, while Olivia stood nervously near the primary control console, her shoulder brushing lightly, almost unconsciously, against Ethan's. Ethan did not look at the dizzying array of digital telemetry screens. He simply watched the physical block of metal. At his quiet nod, Leo Mercer engaged the ignition. The V8 roared to life with a deafening, aggressively beautiful thunder that violently rattled the reinforced observation glass. Slowly, deliberately, Leo pushed the throttle to maximum load, simulating the punishing track conditions that had consistently melted the previous prototypes within 12 minutes. 10 minutes passed. The exhaust manifolds glowed a dull, angry cherry red. 12 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. The temperature gauges on the main screens, which had previously spiked immediately into the catastrophic red zones, remained stubbornly, beautifully pinned within the safe green operational parameters. Ethan's redesigned thermal cycle was working flawlessly, absorbing and redirecting the immense heat with an elegant, almost breathing rhythm. At the 30-minute mark, Arthur Sterling finally exhaled, a slow, deeply satisfied sound, while the arrogant color completely drained from Marcus Vance's sleek face. The malicious board member turned on his heel and marched silently out of the observation room, his hostile takeover completely, unequivocally crushed by a man who had been changing oil in a roadside shack just weeks prior. The room erupted into cheers, the exhausted engineering team embracing one another in sheer disbelief. Amidst the chaotic celebration, Olivia turned to Ethan, her eyes shining brilliantly with unshed tears of relief and overwhelming gratitude. Without a word, Ethan reached out, his calloused, slightly scarred hand gently catching hers. In the deafening roar of the perfectly running engine he had brought back to life, their fingers intertwined, cementing a victory that was as much about the awakening of a stalled machine as it was about the miraculous resurrection of a broken man's heart. Chapter 6. A New Beginning. The official launch of the Sterling Apex did not merely succeed. It shattered the very metrics by which the automotive world measured triumph. Within 48 hours of its unveiling at the International Exposition, the supercar had obliterated 3 long-standing track records for hybrid endurance and velocity, sending shockwaves through a global industry that had previously whispered about the imminent demise of Sterling Motors. Orders poured in from every corner of the earth, transforming our once-stalled prototype into the most coveted machine of the decade, and elevating the company's prestige to heights it had never occupied in its 40-year history. Standing amidst the glittering black-tie crowd at the Victory Gala in Seattle's grandest glass pavilion was Alistair Finch. Alistair is 64 years old, the undisputed dean of global automotive journalism, possessing a deeply lined face permanently weathered by decades of trackside exhaust and sharp, wire-rimmed spectacles that sat precariously on his pointed nose. He is a notoriously cynical man who has spent a lifetime watching slick corporate marketing gimmicks systematically destroy true engineering integrity, molding him into a critic whose rare praise could make a career and whose scorn could end one. Yet, as he watched the apex gleaming under the pavilion lights, Alistair's usual critical sneer was entirely absent, replaced by a profound, reverent awe. He openly murmured to anyone listening that the engine's thermal architecture was nothing short of mechanical poetry. I watched this spectacle from my accustomed position in the shadows near the main stage, a quiet witness to the absolute vindication of Olivia's sacrifices and Ethan's quiet genius. The sheer noise of the celebration faded into a collective, expectant silence when Arthur Sterling stepped up to the microphone, his silver hair catching the amber spotlight like a crown. He looked out over the sea of shareholders, executives, and journalists, his face entirely stripped of its usual stone-cold corporate mask, revealing instead the deep, serene satisfaction of a patriarch who had fought his final battle and won. 41 years ago, I started this company in a drafty garage with nothing but a toolbox and a stubborn refusal to fail. Arthur's resonant voice filled the cavernous room, carrying an emotional weight that brought a sudden stillness to the audience. We built an empire on innovation, but an empire is nothing without a soul. And tonight, I am officially announcing my retirement as Chief Executive Officer. The future of Sterling Motors belongs to a new generation, and I am proudly handing the keys of this kingdom to a man who possesses a brilliant engineering mind and an unyielding strength of character. Ladies and gentlemen, your new CEO, Ethan Carter. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom before exploding into a thunderous, standing ovation as Ethan stepped onto the stage. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that Arthur had practically forced him into, yet he carried himself with the exact same unhurried, unassuming humility he had displayed while wiping grease onto a shop rag in his cinder-block garage. He did not deliver a flashy, rehearsed corporate speech. He simply thanked the team, looked directly at Arthur with deep, silent gratitude, and promised to keep building machines that were honest, precise, and true to the hands that crafted them. When the formal presentations finally dissolved into the softer rhythms of the late-night celebration, Ethan quietly slipped away from the congratulatory crowds, guiding Olivia out onto the pavilion's secluded, starlit terrace overlooking the black velvet expanse of Puget Sound. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the stifling heat of the ballroom, and the sky above was a brilliant, cloudless tapestry of silver stars. Olivia leaned against the stone railing, her eyes reflecting the distant city lights, a soft, breathless laugh escaping her lips as she looked at Ethan. "CEO of Sterling Motors," she whispered, her voice full of wonder and affection. "My father has never trusted anyone with his life's work, Ethan. Not until he met you." Ethan did not answer immediately. He stepped closer, his broad shoulders shielding her from the gentle evening breeze, his dark eyes entirely focused on her face with an intensity that made the rest of the world vanish. He reached into his pocket, his calloused fingers trembling slightly, a rarity for a man who could steady a racing engine with a single touch, and pulled out a modest, vintage velvet box. "I used to think my life ended 5 years ago, Olivia," Ethan said, his voice a low, gravelly tremor that vibrated with absolute sincerity. "I built a wall around my heart because I thought protecting Lily meant staying in the dark forever. But you walked into my messy garage, you loved my daughter, and you brought me back into the light. I don't care about the title or the corner office, Olivia. The only future I want to build is one where I get to stand by your side every single day. Will you marry me?" Olivia's breath caught sharply in her throat, her hands flying to her lips, as tears of pure, unadulterated happiness spilled over her lashes. Looking into the eyes of the man who had healed his own soul, while quietly piecing hers back together, she did not hesitate. She threw her arms around his neck, nodding fiercely against his shoulder as she whispered an ecstatic, breathless yes. The wedding took place 3 months later, at the peak of a glorious, sun-drenched late spring, within the breathtaking, flower-filled private gardens of the Sterling estate. Overseeing the vibrant sea of blooming white roses and fragrant lavender bushes was Beatrice DuPont. Beatrice is a 52-year-old independent wedding coordinator who looks like a walking watercolor painting with her flowing lilac linen dresses, a crown of silver-streaked hair woven loosely with fresh jasmine, and a hopelessly romantic heart that causes her to weep softly into a silk handkerchief at every single ceremony she organizes. She had spent weeks obsessing over every petal, creating a sanctuary of natural beauty that felt entirely divorced from the cold, clinical world of automotive corporate warfare. As the acoustic strings began to play a soft, sweeping melody through the garden, little Lily stole the hearts of every guest in attendance. Walking down the grassy aisle as the flower girl and ring bearer, she wore a beautiful white tulle dress, her wild chestnut curls bouncing happily as she meticulously carried a small velvet pillow holding the rings. She did not look nervous. She looked up at the altar where Ethan and Olivia stood waiting for her small face radiant with the absolute, unshakable certainty that her family was finally whole. When the vows were spoken and the rings were placed, Ethan kissed his new bride under an archway of white blossoms, the small, intimate gathering of family and trusted friends erupting into genuine, joyful applause. The final, enduring image of their journey unfolded as the bright afternoon light began to soften into a deep, amber gold horizon. Away from the cameras, the reporters, and the vast corporate responsibilities that awaited them, Ethan, Olivia, and Lily walked hand in hand down a winding stone path toward the edge of the estate. The long, jagged shadows of their past heartbreaks were completely swallowed by the warm, golden light of the setting sun, their fingers tightly intertwined as they walked together into a beautiful, tronven, and unshakable future. This story reminds us that some of the greatest gifts we possess are not the ones that earn us a corporate title or a heavy wallet, but the ones we use quietly, without needing anyone to notice. In our fast-paced daily lives, it is so easy to chase after validation, to measure our success by how much we accumulate or how high we climb. But the true healing of Ethan Carter did not come from the corner office or the fancy contract. It came when he allowed his heart to open up to love, to family, and to the simple joy of doing what he loved for the people who mattered most. Sometimes, we have to step back into the storm, not to prove something to the world, but to remember who we truly are. If this story touched your heart today, please share it with someone who might be going through a hard time. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more journeys like this. May God bless each and every one of you watching tonight, guarding your families and bringing peace to your souls. If you believe that love and faith can heal any broken season, please write Amen in the comments below.